Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books presents The War for Ukraine, Strategy and Adaptation Under Fire by Mick Ryan, narrated by Cartwright. Introduction. Unlike tsunamis, wars do not appear suddenly on calm waters. Wars follow peace, but rarely are they preceded by peacefulness. James Scher and Igor Gretsky, Why Russia Went to War. This is the story of part of a war. It is only part of a war because at least when this manuscript was completed, the war in Ukraine that was the result of Russia's invasion of February 2022 remained in active conflict. It is part of a war because, as with all wars, there are many things about it, even in this age of social media and greater battlefield transparency, that are yet to be revealed. Some of these unknown elements include secret intelligence activities and special operations missions undertaken by both sides, as well as the fears and motives of many key actors. And it is a partial story of a war because it would be impossible to cover every aspect of this war in a single volume. The study of war is unbelievably vast. This is partly because of war's multiple levels, from tactical to political, but also because war involves many human, technological, conceptual, societal, and organizational aspects. A particular conflict might be studied from many angles, as evidenced by the tens of thousands of books on the US Civil War alone, and similarly about World Wars I and II. This book, like any other to be written about the Russo-Ukraine War, can only ever tell part of its overall story. But even at this point in history, there are sufficient stories to tell, and ample observations, that might inform other government and military institutions to evolve and improve their future effectiveness. As such, this book tells the story and makes observations about the period from the beginning of the Russian invasion in February 2022 through to 2023 NATO summit in Vilnius, during which the initial phase of the Ukrainian 2023 counteroffensive was being executed. On 11 June 2023, President Volodymyr Zelensky of Ukraine confirmed that a series of Ukrainian offensives were underway in the country's eastern and southern regions. While providing few details about progress or the forces involved, Zelensky noted, "Counteroffensive and defensive actions are taking place in Ukraine, but I will not say in detail what stage they are at. They are all in a positive mood." This start of the ultimately unsuccessful 2023 campaign by the Ukrainian armed forces to recapture territory occupied by the Russians and liberate their citizens was the culmination of 16 months of effort by the Ukrainians and their international supporters. Over that time, the Ukrainians lost tens of thousands of soldiers defending their nation and lost approximately 20% of their territory. Multiple cities and towns were destroyed, and Ukrainian citizens had been tortured, raped, killed, maimed, and terrorized by the invading Russian military forces. Concurrently, Western nations, led by the United States of America, provided mountains of assistance to the government of Ukraine. Tens of billions of dollars in military equipment and munitions had been provided, as had training assistance by multiple nations. Economic assistance, humanitarian aid, and intelligence support rounded out the unique international coalition of nations that were helping Ukraine to defend itself and retain its sovereignty. The antecedents of this war can be traced back months, years, decades, or even centuries. Eminent historian of Ukraine, Serhiy Plokhy, has written, "Russia's aggression against Ukraine produced a 19th century war fought with 20th century tactics and 21st century weapons. Its ideological underpinnings come from visions of territorial expansion that characterized the Russian imperial era." The immediate cause of the war, however, was Russia's invasion. On the morning of 24 February 2022, a live video feed from the southern Ukrainian Kalanchuk border outpost showed Ukrainian policemen chatting with border guards at this frontier crossing from Crimea into Ukraine. Shortly afterward, soldiers and civilians flee across the screen. Russian vehicles are then seen moving through the crossing, and not long afterward, the video feed is severed. These images, which were shared on Twitter within minutes of the event, are the first known pictures of the Russian military invasion of Ukraine that commenced that day. It is a very modern way for a war to announce itself in the consciousness of people in Ukraine and beyond. And while news of the beginning of the war may have been transmitted in a very 21st century manner, much of the war that has followed has hewed more closely to 20th and even 19th century ideas and tactics. The war has featured large-scale battles with armoured vehicles and human waves of infantry. Artillery, often described as the king of battle, has reasserted its place in the contemporary battlefield as the most prolific killer of all weapons used. Industrial-scale warfare with massive use of autonomous systems and munitions has become the norm. At the same time, old ideas of city destruction and the deliberate and systemic terrorizing of civilians has been widely practiced by the Russian military. Places such as Busha, Irpin, and others have been seared into the psyche of Ukrainians and many around the world because of the brutal and systemic torture, rape, and murder that were inflicted on innocent Ukrainian civilians in those places. In every town and city occupied by the Russians, they have established facilities for the detention, processing, and interrogation of Ukrainian civilians. These facilities had layouts that were almost exactly the same across occupied Ukraine, including the similar electrocution machines and torture chambers. Beyond these tactics of systemic terrorism, the injection of new technologies has also played a role. Autonomous systems in the air, at sea, and on the ground have improved reconnaissance, lengthened the reach of military forces, and closed the time between the detection and destruction of military units, establishments, and individuals. Digitized battlefield command support networks have shared awareness and permitted improved command and control of troops on the ground, as well as the enhanced integration of air and missile defense systems. Similar information technologies have also assisted the targeting of regional and global information operations to influence the perceptions of Ukraine's and Russia's allies and friends. In Conduct of War in the 21st Century, Rob Johnson, Tim Swice, and Martin Kitson describe 21st century warfare as kinetic, connected, and synthetic. Written and published a year before the Russian invasion of Ukraine, this is an apt description of the brutal war that has ravaged Ukraine. But the authors also propose one important further element of future war that has played out during operations in Ukraine. Despite the many new technologies starting to have an impact on war, it is the human dimension that will surely assert itself in war in the near future, just as it does in the present. The speeches and influence of President Zelensky, the organic Ukrainian resistance that has played a part throughout the war, and the many instances of poor Russian strategic and battlefield leadership are exemplars of this fact. War in Central Europe is not an unusual thing if we take a longer-term view. Humans have fought over land, titles, treasure, and ideas throughout the modern history of Europe. Most recently, in the 1990s, Europe was convulsed over the conflict in the former Republic of Yugoslavia. The many different elements of this conflict reintroduced Europe to concepts such as ethnic cleansing, land warfare, and air campaigns, notions that had been thought to have been now just a part of history and not an element in Europe's future. Since then, Europe has been largely peaceful, with the exception of Russia's invasions of Georgia and Ukraine in 2014. It dispatched troops to faraway lands such as Sudan, Iraq, and Afghanistan for stabilization, peacekeeping, and counter-insurgency missions. But until 2021, when Russia's President Putin began a military build-up on the borders of Ukraine, the prospect of war in Europe itself was a distant one. Even the build-up of Russian ground and air power, obvious through openly available satellite imagery, did not convince many people in Europe that a large-scale war might be a possibility in the near future. Almost up to the moment that Russian soldiers crossed the Ukrainian frontiers, there were hopes that war could be avoided. It is natural that most people might think this way. As Victor Davis Hanson writes in The Father of Us All, By ignoring military history, those today are naturally liable to interpret war because of the failure of communication, of diplomacy, as if aggressors do not know exactly what they are doing, who, after all, would knowingly start a violent, unnecessary war. Unfortunately for Ukraine and Europe, Putin had long harbored resentments to those former members of the Soviet Union who had left during the dissolution of the Russian Empire after the Cold War. He had also been telegraphing his future intentions in speeches and other media. In July 2021, Putin published an article titled "On the Historical Unity of Russians and Ukrainians." In it, he described Russians and Ukrainians as one people, a single whole. Reaching back to the ancient state of Rus, Putin justified his position by describing Russians and Ukrainians as the descendants of this common ancestor. After a long description of his view of the history of Ukraine and Russia, Putin then described the situation in 2021 thus: "We are facing the creation of a climate of fear in Ukrainian society, aggressive rhetoric, indulging neo-Nazis, and militarizing the country. Along with that, we are witnessing not just complete dependence, but direct external control, including the supervision of the Ukrainian authorities, security services and armed forces by foreign advisors, military development of the territory of Ukraine, and deployment of NATO infrastructure." Here, Putin lays the groundwork of his strategic narrative to justify his invasion of Ukraine just 7 months later. NATO expansion, neo-Nazis, and anti-Russia hatreds all feature in Putin's publicly expressed rationale for invading Ukraine in his speech to the Russian people on the eve of the 24th February 2022 invasion. In this discourse, he describes how the leading NATO countries are supporting the far-right nationalists and neo-Nazis in Ukraine, and declares that Russian forces will demilitarize and denazify Ukraine. Russian forces crossed the Ukrainian border at multiple locations on 24 February 2022, while large ground formations made their way toward Kiev, Kharkiv, Kherson, and other strategic objectives. Russian Air Force aircraft missiles conducted a series of strikes against Ukrainian air defense radars, airfields, headquarters, and other critical military and government targets. Envisioned as a 10-day campaign in which Russian soldiers rapidly advanced on the Ukrainian capital of Kiev and were welcomed as liberators, the Ukrainian government fled, and the West did not assist Ukraine. The invasion went wrong almost from the very beginning. The strategic planning for their invasion was undertaken by a very small number of personnel, and operational security was very tight. This operational security and resulting deception did allow the Russians to achieve some measure of tactical surprise in the early hours of the invasion, but it also meant that most commanders, until just hours before D-Day, remained under the impression that their presence along Ukraine's borders was an exercise. Units, therefore, were neither logistically prepared nor morally resilient enough for Ukrainian resistance or for the hard combat that would take place north of Kiev. The Russians had a laundry list of strategic objectives for their invasion. As one report on the invasion from Britain's Royal United Services Institute notes, the goals of the Russian invasion were not only denazification, the destruction of national sovereignty and the banning of Ukrainian identity, and demilitarization, the destruction and banning of the UAF, and the export to Russia of enterprises of the defense industrial complex of Ukraine, but also denuclearization, the capture of nuclear power plants and their transfer to the direct management of Rosatom. To achieve these objectives, the Russians assembled a large invasion force, around 180,000 to 190,000 troops, which comprised approximately two-thirds of its existing strength of its ground forces. This figure does not include the many thousands of Air Force and other military personnel who played a supporting role away from the front lines. Unfortunately, this was not a big enough force if the Ukrainian military, numbering around 200,000 troops, put up any form of resistance. This is where the Russian strategy began to break down. Their invasion force was too small for the tasks assigned to it in the seizure of a nation the size of Ukraine. The Ukrainians further confounded Russian planning by not conforming to any of the Russian leadership's assumptions about the conduct of the war. The Russian invasion, while taking nearly 22% of Ukrainian territory in the coming weeks, founded on poor strategic assumptions. Good Ukrainian leadership, particularly the inspiration of President Zelensky, but also effective battlefield leaders, a lack of unity command between different Russian commands, and bad Russian tactical leadership. While this book covers many aspects of the war, its focus is on observations about what can be learned by government and military institutions in Ukraine, Europe, and beyond. An important function of senior leaders in the military and other national security institutions is providing incentives for learning and innovation during peacetime, so that the good ideas, the right organizational constructs, and cutting-edge technology can be combined to provide an advantage in conflicts. This, in turn, requires a cultural predisposition to learning and sharing lessons widely, the acceptance of failure as an opportunity to learn, and a well-honed understanding of risk. War, the most destructive human endeavor yet devised, is also a learning opportunity for military institutions. But the study of learning in war is not as simple as drawing a direct line from learning to battlefield prowess. The large-scale collection, assessment, sharing, and absorption of lessons is complex, especially when considering all the other challenges and demands placed on military institutions that are concurrently amid fighting, planning for the next fight, and bringing in new members while steadily losing others to death, wounds, and sickness. But as hard as it is harder to win if an institution has a suboptimal learning culture or lacks one altogether. The process of how each side has learned during this war will absorb academics and military institutions for some time into the future. However, in this book, I propose that there are 6 guidelines that might be useful in a professional, strategic approach to learning and adaptation. A foundational issue is that of purpose. Why should military organizations look at lessons from war in general, and this one in particular? The answer is that the world is constantly changing, and a clever institution will learn from the mistakes of others, rather than constantly making its own mistakes in adapting to change. As David Barno and Nora Ben-Sahel argue in Adaptation Under Fire, this process of learning is easier to talk about in principle than to achieve in practice. Bureaucratic resistance, battlefield friction, and the enemy's adaptations all make it harder. But it is possible to learn and change, as historically successful military forces show. A second consideration in learning is to distinguish between lessons that are specific to this war and those that are broader and more widely applicable. This is hard because only in retrospect can such a judgment generally be made. Consequently, at this point in the war, and given our limited insights into Ukrainian military strategy and force generation, almost all our observations appear to have wider or general utility. These include leadership, combined arms, air-land integration, information warfare, air defense, alliances, and logistics. A third consideration for exploring military learning from the war in Ukraine is the level at which this occurs. In their 1988 exploration of learning, innovation, and military effectiveness, Williamson Murray and Alan Millett propose a 4-layered approach: political, strategic, operational, and tactical. In making the most of the opportunity to learn from the Russo-Ukrainian War, military institutions, operational analysts, and academics must invest in each of these 4 levels to gain a full view of the war and understand how each level interacts with and changed activities in the other layers. A fourth issue in learning from Ukraine is that it provides the opportunity to identify both solutions from either side, as well as future challenges for which there are no current solutions. A strategic learning and lessons process that examines the Russian invasion and subsequent war must not only be about copying what the eventual victor did. Military institutions and strategists must dig deeper for other challenges that are not obvious or that neither side may have produced a robust solution for. A fifth consideration in collecting, analyzing, disseminating, and absorbing the lessons from this war is understanding the difference between lessons and lessons learned. It is one matter to make observations. It is quite another to effect change in a military or other government institution based on those lessons. The US Army has useful definitions for both. A lesson is knowledge or understanding gained by experience. Success and failures are both considered sources of lessons. A lesson learned is when you can measure a change in behavior. This is a useful distinction. For the purposes of this book, I would describe my observations and analysis as lessons rather than lessons learned. Finally, in observing the war and analyzing its many lessons, Western military institutions will also have to assess what other potential adversaries might learn from it. China has previously demonstrated a deep capacity for learning and change, given the right political and strategic impetus. The 1991 Gulf War shocked the Chinese military into a decades-long recapitalization of its military, which has included advanced ships, aircraft, ground combat vehicles, and satellites. It has also resulted in reforms to strategic and operational command and control, including better joint integration. Chinese lessons from the 1991 Gulf War, as well as the wars spawned by 9/11, have included a reformation in their operational doctrine and has resulted in concepts such as intelligentization and systems destruction warfare. As with previous Western conflicts, it is highly likely that Chinese analysts will explore the war in Ukraine for its many relevant lessons. The Ukrainians throughout this war have arguably displayed a superior learning culture compared to the Russians. Margarita Konev and Owen Daniels have written that over and over, Ukraine has nimbly responded to changing battle. By contrast, Russian forces have shown limited openness to new tactics or new technologies. This learning culture, willingness to take risk and innovate, and capacity to rapidly absorb new technologies, such as HIMARS, Western main battle tanks, or HARM missiles, and integrate them into their operations, clearly did not emerge on 24 February 2022. The Ukrainians learned from Russian operations in 2014 and their military operations in eastern Ukraine since. They have also benefited from their training and education interventions provided at NATO schools in Europe and their interaction with US and European military forces. This provided a foundational capacity for learning and adaptation on which Ukrainian armed forces' innovation and improvements in military effectiveness have been based since February 2022. But as the early stages of the 2023 Ukrainian counteroffensive also demonstrated, there are limits to how much and how fast any institution can change. These adaptation pains show that while Ukraine has adapted at the tactical, operational, and strategic levels since February 2022, these have not driven major improvements in their ability to expand the level at which they can conduct effective combined arms maneuver. The initial problems with Ukrainian attacks in southern Ukraine demonstrate that even good learning cultures can and do experience shortfalls in performance on the battlefield. When the Russians invaded Ukraine again in 2022, they brought with them a legacy learning culture, but it appears to often, though not always, be inferior to the Ukrainian model. This issue was covered in the recent report from the Royal United Services Institute, which notes that those who fail are usually replaced or threatened with punishment. Far from incentivizing success, this often leads to dishonest reporting in which the blame for failure is transferred onto others. This obscures the actual operational problems that must be solved. These only become apparent when they can no longer be concealed, slowing the learning of lessons. The Russians, however, clearly did learn from their operations in places such as Chechnya and Syria. Journal articles and speeches from senior Russian military officers frequently referred to these conflicts. Whether these were the right lessons, however, might be questioned. The Russians also appear to have assumed they would be fighting the same Ukrainian army that existed in 2014. Multiple reports from human intelligence sources before the war led the Russians to believe that the Ukrainians, much like in Crimea in 2014, were unlikely to put up a sustained fight in resistance to the Russian forces entering the country from the north, east and south. A 2017 RAND report on the 2014 Crimean annexation notes that Ukraine's overall superior forces on the peninsula offered no resistance. The Russian army and the Russian leadership assumed something similar would occur in February 2022. The Russian army's learning culture, therefore, entered the war with flaws. As a result, they possessed a suboptimal foundation for learning and adapting once fighting began. With the war in its second year, there is a competitive learning environment in the Ukraine war. Both sides, in different ways, are continually reaching for tactical, operational, and strategic advantages. It is an ongoing adaptation battle and is likely to be one of the key factors in which side eventually wins this war. Many nations are watching this war closely, with an eye to their own success in future warfare. In learning from this war, Western military institutions will need to invest in and apply collection, analysis, dissemination, and adaptation processes. Importantly, as Don Starry described in To Change an Army, this will require leadership from the top. But it is a systemic undertaking and must have leadership, incentives, and the rapid collection and processing of observations into lessons and then lessons learned. It must be deeply embedded in the culture of an organization. As Amy Fox Godden writes in Learning to Fight, culture determines how an organization responds to change. For the army of the First World War, it determined how it identified lessons, how it innovated, and ultimately, how it learned to fight. The central hypothesis of this book is that while many factors have had an impact on the course of this war, there are two that have been of overriding importance. These two factors, around which the contents of this book are framed, are strategy and adaptation. It is these two areas where the differences between the approach of the Ukrainians and Russians in this war have been most stark. And arguably, it is these two areas where Ukraine has developed an asymmetric advantage over Russia. The word strategy entered the modern European lexicon in 1771. The source was the publication of a translation of the Byzantine Emperor Leo VI's Tactica by French officer Paul-Gideon Joly de Mézeroy. The translated work included descriptions of strategia. This word was translated as strategy, and by the early 1800s, European military theorists were using the word strategy. Used to describe the higher arts of military planning in early 19th century Europe, strategy has since then transformed in both theory and practice. Over the last century, the application and meaning of strategy has evolved. Originally applied to the preparation of military organizations for war, it is a term that has come to be associated with larger national pursuits, particularly in the wake of the total wars of the 20th century, and it is used across other endeavors not related to national security. Most businesses now have corporate strategies, and it is a word that is used very widely across many human endeavors. So Lawrence Friedman is an eminent scholar who literally wrote the book on strategy. In Strategy, a History, 2013, he observes that it only really comes into play when elements of conflict are present. Conflict was present in the lead-up to the war, and in the latest Russian invasion of Ukraine in February 2022, and it has existed throughout the conduct of the war thus far. There is an important reason that the first part of this book is about strategy. The war in Ukraine offers academics, politicians, military leaders, and civil servants an abundance of observations on the development and execution of strategy from the perspectives of the Ukrainians, Russians, Americans, and others. There are many examples of effective strategy development and its implementation from the war. There are also examples of poor strategy and even worse execution of it. Russian strategy has been explored by a multitude of government analysts as well as experts in academia and think tanks throughout the Cold War into the post-Cold War era, and now in what some have described as the post-Cold War era. There is a significant body of literature that explores Soviet and Russian strategy over the past 7 decades, including nuclear strategy, conventional warfare, and its strategy for confrontation with the West. Ukrainian strategy in this war has much shallower roots. While it possesses a culture and history that extends back centuries, it has been...
Sample complete. Ready to continue?